I still remember the morning the lake changed color. It used to shimmer like a piece of glass under the sunrise, clear, calm, and alive. Every ripple carried the soft reflection of pine trees that surrounded it, like nature's own painting. For 15 years, I'd walked that same dirt path, fishing rod over my shoulder, coffee steaming in my thermos, ready to greet the day in silence. But that morning, the silence felt wrong. Even the birds didn't sing. The air smelled off, sharp and chemical, like burnt plastic mixed with something rotten. I thought maybe the storm last night had stirred up debris. But when I reached the dock and looked down, I froze. The lake wasn't blue anymore. It was green. Not the healthy, algae green you see in summer ponds. This was bright neon, unnatural, glowing under the morning sun like something toxic. And then I saw them, fish. Dozens of them. Floating belly up, motionless. The lake that had once given me peace now looked like a graveyard. I dropped my thermos, the metal clanging against the wood, echoing through the dead stillness. I ran my hand through the air above the water, trying to convince myself it was some kind of illusion. Maybe fertilizer runoff. Maybe some prank. But the smell was too strong, too deliberate. Someone had done this. Someone had killed my lake. That lake wasn't just a body of water, it was my refuge, my escape from the noise of the homeowners association, the gossiping neighbors, the endless complaints about my unapproved shed or my rustic mailbox. I didn't care much for their rules, and they didn't care much for my fishing. But I never imagined they'd go this far. I took out my phone, recording everything, the dead fish, the slime, the strange foam collecting along the edges. I planned to call the local environmental department, maybe even the news. But before I could, I heard a car engine behind me, crunching gravel. It was Frank, the HOA president, wearing his usual smug grin and golf cap. He stepped out of his car like he owned the earth under his shoes. "Morning, Joe," he said, pretending not to notice the devastation behind me. "Beautiful day, huh?" I turned and glared at him. "What the hell happened here, Frank?" He squinted at the lake, scratching his chin like he was seeing it for the first time. "Huh. Must be some kind of natural bloom. Happens sometimes." "Natural bloom?" I snapped. "You think this is natural?" I pointed at the fish, their white bellies glinting under the sun. "That's poison." He just smiled, that lazy politician smile, and said, "Well, maybe nature's telling us it's time to take a break from all that fishing. You know, let the ecosystem rest." My stomach twisted. He knew. He knew exactly what happened. And worse, he was proud of it. "You did this," I said quietly. He didn't answer. Just turned to his car and said, "You should probably head home, Joe. HOA's already investigating. Wouldn't want you interfering." Then he drove off, leaving dust swirling in the air, like the ghosts of the fish beneath the surface. That was the moment I realized something deeper was going on. The HOA had been after me for months, letters, fines, even threats of legal action. All because I refused to comply with their new policy banning fishing in the community lake. They claimed it was for safety and wildlife preservation. But I knew it was about control. They wanted the lake for themselves, for boating, parties, barbecues, and fancy events. Fishing didn't fit the picture-perfect image they were selling to new residents. So when I kept showing up with my rod and tackle box, they had to find another way to stop me. I didn't realize then just how far they'd go, or how poetic justice would eventually be. Because what they didn't know was that this lake, my lake, wasn't just a decoration for their real estate flyers. It was also their water supply. Every glass of water that HOA board drank came straight from the same poison veins they had tainted to spite me. But that revelation would come later. That day, all I could do was watch as the wind carried the stench of decay across the water. I spent hours there, kneeling on the dock, watching dragonflies hover helplessly over the scum, their wings catching the light before disappearing into the mess. Every few minutes, another fish would float up, bumping softly against the wood. I whispered an apology to each one, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I felt guilty for not protecting the lake sooner. Maybe because I knew this wasn't just about fish, it was about people. About greed. About what happens when power sits in the wrong hands. As the sun rose higher, I noticed a faint shimmer near the far shore, like a small pipe or drain bubbling into the lake. I followed the edge, my boots squelching in the mud, until I reached it, a black PVC pipe hidden beneath some brush, dripping a thick greenish sludge straight into the water. I recorded that too. Evidence. Proof. Whoever did this wasn't just careless, they were deliberate. I followed the pipe back through the brush, across the walking trail, until it disappeared beneath the concrete foundation of the community clubhouse. My heart sank. The HOA had done this. No doubt. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fish, their eyes clouded and lifeless. I decided then I'd expose them, every lie, every cover-up. They thought they could silence me by killing my lake. They didn't realize they'd just started a war. That night, I barely slept. The image of that black pipe oozing poison into the lake replayed in my head like a bad dream that wouldn't fade. The frogs had stopped croaking, the crickets had gone silent, even nature seemed to hold its breath. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through environmental laws, HOA regulations, anything that could help me understand what I was up against. But the deeper I read, the more I realized how twisted it all was. The HOA had power, real power, not just over lawns and fences, but over the land itself. They owned the lake, the pipes, the water management system. And if I wanted to prove they poisoned it, I'd have to catch them in the act. At sunrise, I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and a wrench. I headed back to the clubhouse, that fancy building the HOA loved to show off during neighborhood barbecues. From the outside, it looked perfect, white siding, trimmed hedges, the flag gently waving in the morning breeze. But beneath it, I knew, was the artery pumping poison into my lake. I crouched near the maintenance door behind the building, the one marked, authorized personnel only. It was locked, of course. But after 15 years in this community, I knew where the spare key was hidden, under the third flower pot to the left. Some secrets don't change. Inside, the air smelled of bleach and paint, the kind of sterile scent that covers something rotten. I moved quietly down the narrow hall toward the boiler room, my flashlight flickering across pipes and valves. Then I saw it, the same black PVC pipe I'd found yesterday. It ran along the floor, up the wall, and into a large metal drum labeled, algae control solution, restricted use only. I knelt closer. The drum was half empty. My chest tightened. This wasn't just negligence, this was a crime. Someone had deliberately dumped chemicals straight into the water system. I took photos, every angle, every label. I even captured the serial number stamped on the drum. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps, slow, steady, deliberate. My pulse spiked. I killed the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall. The door creaked open, spilling in the golden light of morning. 2 voices echoed in. One of them was unmistakably Frank's. The other was a woman's, sharp, commanding. "The lake looks terrible," she said. "The residents are asking questions." Frank laughed, low and smug. "Good. Maybe they'll stop fishing and mind their own business. We'll clean it up next week once it's all settled." The woman replied, "You mean once it's all hidden?" I clenched my jaw. Every word confirmed it, they'd done this on purpose. Frank and whoever that woman was, likely Karen, the HOA treasurer, were behind it. I wanted to burst out right there, shove the photos in their faces, scream at them for murdering the lake. But I stayed quiet. This wasn't the time. I needed proof that would hold up beyond doubt. As soon as they left, I slipped out the back and drove straight to the county's environmental office. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her smile fading when she saw my face. "Sir, are you all right?" "I need to report an environmental violation," I said, laying my phone on the counter and pulling up the photos. She scrolled through them, frowning. "That's not just algae control," she whispered. "That's copper sulfate and chloramine, highly toxic in that concentration." She took my information, promised to send an investigator, and told me not to confront anyone yet. But patience was never my strong suit. That afternoon, HOA trucks arrived near the lake. Workers in neon vests started laying out hoses, skimming the surface, pretending to clean. But I noticed something strange, they weren't removing the sludge, they were pushing it deeper, forcing it toward the drainage pipe at the far end of the lake. It hit me, they were flushing the evidence. My blood boiled. I started recording again, narrating every detail, every movement. This wasn't going to be buried under paperwork or excuses. Not this time. As I filmed, I noticed something else. One of the workers pulled out a small device from the water, like a pump or filter. It had the HOA's logo stamped on it, but it also had another name, Clearflow Systems Incorporated. I didn't recognize it, but I knew enough to suspect it wasn't just a local contractor. Someone was profiting from this, a company tied to the HOA, maybe even owned by one of them. The corruption ran deeper than I thought. That night, I uploaded my footage anonymously to a small environmental watchdog forum. Within hours, replies started flooding in. One user, a retired water engineer, messaged me privately. He said the setup I filmed looked exactly like an illegal chemical feed line, something used to suppress algae blooms artificially in retention ponds. If your HOA used this in a natural lake connected to a water system, he wrote, they've contaminated their own groundwater. I reread that line 3 times. Contaminated their own groundwater. It was like poetic justice unfolding in slow motion. The very people who poisoned my fishing lake had poisoned their own drinking water. 2 days later, the first complaint started appearing on the community's online board. Why does the tap water smell funny? My kid's skin broke out after a shower. Anyone else tasting metal in the water? I watched the panic grow, thread after thread, until the HOA finally announced a temporary issue with the filtration system. They scheduled an emergency board meeting for residents that Friday. I knew I had to be there. When I walked into that meeting, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Dozens of angry neighbors filled the room, some holding bottled water, others holding their bills. Frank stood at the front, sweating through his polo shirt, trying to keep his voice calm. We assure everyone the water is being tested. There's no cause for alarm. But I'd had enough. I stood up, camera in hand, and said, you want to talk about tests, Frank? How about the ones showing copper sulfate levels high enough to kill fish and people? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. Frank's face went pale. Joe, this isn't the time or place. No, this is exactly the time and place, I said, pulling out printed photos of the drum, the pipe, the dead fish. You did this to shut me up. You poisoned our lake, and now you've poisoned our homes. Gasps filled the room. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Someone started filming. Frank stammered, looking toward the treasurer, who stood frozen. You don't know what you're talking about, he said weakly. The lake treatment was routine. Routine. I laughed bitterly. Then why did your vendor register under a fake business name? Why did you tell workers to flush the lake instead of clean it? Why did you hide the chemical feed line under the clubhouse? The crowd erupted. Neighbors shouted questions, demands, accusations. Frank tried to speak, but it was too late. The truth had hit them harder than any fine or rule violation ever could. That night, I uploaded the entire confrontation to my YouTube channel. Within hours, it went viral. People across the country were watching, commenting, demanding accountability. Environmental agencies reached out. News stations started calling. The HOA tried to shut me down, but it was too late, the story was out. As I sat by my window, watching the moonlight shimmer faintly on the poisoned lake, I realized this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. They had tried to bury me, but instead, they'd buried themselves. The morning after the meeting, the neighborhood didn't wake up to birds or the sound of sprinklers, it woke up to sirens. By the time I opened my blinds, county health trucks and news vans were lined along the street like a parade of judgment. Neighbors stood in clusters on their lawns, clutching bottled water and whispering to one another. Every eye that turned toward me carried the same mix of fear and gratitude. For years they'd laughed at the fishing guy who wouldn't follow rules, and now they realized I'd been fighting for all of us. I stepped outside and the air still carried that metallic tang, faint but unmistakable. My phone buzzed nonstop, messages from reporters, environmental officials, even old friends who'd moved away. My video had crossed 1 million views overnight. The HOA office was sealed off with yellow tape, and Frank's car was gone. For the first time in months, the place felt quiet in a different way, not the dead silence of poison, but the heavy pause that comes right before consequences arrive. Reporters chased me for interviews, and though I wanted to crawl back into my house and breathe, I knew telling the truth mattered more. I stood by the lake, the same spot where I used to fish, and spoke to every camera that pointed my way. I told them how the lake had been our lifeline, how greed had turned it toxic, how people had trusted leaders who only cared about control. My voice cracked halfway through, because it wasn't just a story anymore, it was a confession. I loved that lake like family, and I'd watched it die. When the interviews ended, a quiet ripple moved across the surface, the first rain since the poisoning began. Drops fell slowly, tapping the dead algae, breaking it apart. It felt like the world was finally trying to wash the truth clean. By noon, the health department confirmed what I already knew: the contamination had spread through the groundwater. The HOA's filtration system had failed weeks ago. Residents had been bathing, cooking, and drinking tainted water. Panic swept through the neighborhood faster than any rumor ever had. People packed their cars, called lawyers, and demanded refunds on homes. The same board that fined me for leaving my boat tied too long was now facing criminal charges. Frank's smug grin was gone from every newsletter, his resignation email leaked within hours. He blamed miscommunication and third-party contractors. But the documents the county recovered told another story: signatures, payments, approvals. The HOA hadn't just been careless, they'd signed off on everything. When the officers showed up at Frank's house 2 days later, I watched from my porch. He didn't fight. Didn't even argue. Just kept repeating, it was supposed to help. The moment the door closed behind him, the neighborhood finally exhaled. Justice had begun, but the damage was deeper than anyone could see. The lake still glowed faintly green, its edges ringed with foam, and every time the wind shifted, that bitter smell reminded me that victory never feels clean. Weeks passed. Cleanup crews arrived with pumps and filters, scientists tested the soil, and the county started building a new waterline that bypassed the lake entirely. But the real change was in the people. Neighbors who used to wave from a distance now stopped to talk. They asked questions, offered help, even joined local environmental groups. The HOA was dissolved and replaced with an open committee. For the first time, the community belonged to everyone again. One evening, a little boy I'd never met walked up holding a small fishing rod. "My dad said when the lake gets better, you'll teach me how to fish," he said. I smiled for the first time in months. "Yeah, kid," I told him. "When the lake's ready, we'll both be here." It's strange how fast a story becomes evidence. 1 month after the arrests, my video wasn't just trending, it was being played in a courtroom. The same shaky footage I'd filmed while my hands trembled on that dock now flickered on a projector while lawyers argued over words like malice, liability, and public endangerment. I sat in the back row, a spectator to the chaos I'd started. Frank looked smaller than I remembered, his trademark arrogance replaced by exhaustion. The treasurer, Karen, sat beside him, eyes red, staring at the table instead of the judge. When the prosecutor laid out the timeline, every email, every payment to Clearflow Systems, the room fell silent. Every person in that courtroom realized the same thing at once: they hadn't just poisoned a lake, they'd poisoned trust. Reporters clustered outside the courthouse, microphones waiting like vultures. I told them what I'd told everyone else: this was never about revenge. It was about accountability. The HOA had ruled through fear, fines, threats, and silence, and now they were learning what silence costs. Inside, expert witnesses described how the toxins leached into the soil, how long the lake would need to recover. 23 years, one of them said. My stomach sank. 23 years before it would be safe again to fish, to swim, to drink. I wondered if I'd even be alive to see it clear. After court, the county offered to name a restoration program after me, the Joe Miller Water Stewardship Project. I didn't know how to respond. It felt surreal hearing my name tied to something noble when all I'd done was refuse to shut up. Still, I accepted. The grant money they raised funded cleanup drones, algae-eating microbes, and filtration fences. Slowly, the poison began to lift. But justice isn't tidy. Some neighbors moved away, unable to bear the reminders. Others blamed me for ruining property values. One evening, as I was packing gear into my truck, a man I barely knew approached and said, "You could have handled it quietly. Now everyone thinks we're the toxic neighborhood." I looked him straight in the eye and said, "We were the toxic neighborhood. I just made sure people noticed." He didn't answer. Just walked off into the dusk. Despite the tension, something hopeful started growing. Kids painted murals of the lake as it once was, families volunteered on weekends to plant reeds and lilies along the shore. The county sent scientists to teach residents how to monitor water quality. It wasn't the same lake, but it was ours again. One morning, I found a tiny frog clinging to the dock post, life returning, slow and stubborn. I snapped a photo and smiled for the first time in weeks. When sentencing day came, Frank apologized publicly. His voice shook as he admitted everything, the chemical deals, the cover-ups, even the attempt to frame the contamination as a natural bloom. He got 5 years. Karen got 3. Watching them led away didn't feel triumphant, it felt heavy, like closing a book that had already taken too long to read. The judge thanked me for persistence, but I didn't feel like a hero. Heroes save things. I was still trying to repair what was lost. That night, back home, I poured a glass of bottled water and set my camera up again. The video title read, "When Justice Finally Arrives." I spoke directly to the lens. "It's not enough to win once," I said. "You have to keep watching, keep asking questions. Because power doesn't sleep, it just changes shape. And if you're the one person willing to stand up, be ready for the fallout. It's worth it." I smiled, faint but real. If you've made it this far, you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe, share, and stay alert. Because next time, it might be your lake. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle this time, washing the dirt from my porch. For the first time since the day everything died, the water that touched my hands felt clean. A full year passed before the water began to look like water again. At first it was just a change in smell, the sharp chemical bite faded, replaced by the earthy scent of rain on clean mud. Then came the color. The bright, sickly green softened into pale blue, and for the first time since the poisoning, I could see the faint reflection of the clouds again. Every morning I walked down the same path, not with a fishing rod this time, but with a notebook, logging every sign of recovery, new reeds pushing through the shallows, dragonflies returning to hover above the surface, frogs croaking at dusk. It was slow, fragile progress, but progress all the same. The county still kept signs posted, "Do not fish. Do not swim." I didn't argue. Healing couldn't be rushed. The town had changed too. Without the old HOA, people actually talked to each other. Instead of letters and fines, they shared tools and coffee. We'd built a small committee that met every month to check water reports, plan cleanup days, and keep the system honest. Every meeting began the same way, with silence for the lake we'd lost, and hope for the one we were rebuilding. Sometimes I'd sit in those meetings quietly, watching new volunteers, teenagers, families, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, sign up to help. That was the part that got to me. Out of all the noise, something real had survived. One afternoon, I stood by the dock as a light breeze rippled across the surface. A small child, the same boy who'd once asked me to teach him how to fish, was skipping stones. He looked up and said, "When it's ready, you'll show me, right?" I smiled. "Yeah. When it's ready." He grinned, tossed another stone, and ran off. Watching him, I realized what I'd been fighting for wasn't just the lake, it was the idea that something worth loving can always come back if you refuse to give up on it. The online world had moved on. My channel still existed, but the headlines had faded. That was fine with me. I kept posting updates, small ones now, how to test water pH, how to report pollution, how to stay informed. A smaller audience watched, but they cared. They sent stories from their own towns, rivers saved, ponds cleaned, communities waking up. That's when I understood the full circle of it. My fight had never been just about this place. It was about every place that people stopped noticing. The last scene I filmed for the series was simple. I set the camera on the dock and hit record. The lake behind me shimmered faintly in the sunset, gold spilling across the ripples. I didn't write a script, I just spoke. "A year ago, this was dead," I said. "Now, it's breathing again. It's not perfect, but neither are we. What matters is that we kept going. Every time you refuse to stay silent, you bring something back to life." I paused and let the sound of wind and water fill the silence. If you've been here from the start, thank you. If you're new, welcome. Subscribe if you believe that small voices can still make big changes. Because the lake's not the only thing that deserves a second chance. I turned off the camera, but I stayed there long after dark. Fireflies drifted over the water, blinking like tiny stars. Somewhere beneath the surface, I thought I saw a flicker, a shadow darting through the shallows. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was what I hoped it was, the first fish returning home. Either way, I smiled and whispered to the night, "Welcome back." The wind carried the ripples outward, the dock creaked softly, and for the first time in a very long time, the lake answered with the quiet sound of life.